The basement air was heavy with the scent of damp concrete and stagnant water. David Walker pressed the wrench against the brass nut, his knuckles white with the strain of the final turn. The drip, which had been a steady rhythmic pulse against the floorboards, ceased. He gave the pipe a firm shake. It held. David wiped a smear of grime from his forehead, packed his heavy steel tools into the battered box, and latched the lid. He climbed the wooden stairs, his boots thudding against the steps, emerging into the bright, silent kitchen. The homeowner stood waiting. She slid a check across the granite countertop. David took it, folded the paper once, and tucked it into his pocket. He stepped out through the front door into the sharp morning air. His truck sat at the curb, its frame marked by years of salt and road wear. He tossed the toolbox onto the passenger seat, checked his watch, and turned the key. The engine groaned, sputtered, and finally caught. He shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the house behind to find the next leak. The city moved at a frantic pace. On every corner, people traded their paychecks for status. David watched them through his windshield. His friends spent their weekends chasing the glow of luxury watches and the shine of new cars, tethering their worth to objects that lost value the moment they left the lot. David drove past the showrooms and the crowded malls, his eyes fixed on a different horizon. He parked his truck 2 blocks away from the main commercial district and walked into a quiet, wood-paneled brokerage office. The atmosphere inside was cold and orderly. He approached the clerk, pulled a thick envelope from his pocket, and slid it across the counter. "Into the index fund," he said. The clerk looked up, nodded, and began typing. She processed the transaction without a word or a glance at his calloused hands. David watched the screen as the numbers refreshed, marking a small, permanent shift in his trajectory. He did not ask for a receipt. He turned, walked back out into the noise of the city, and headed toward his next job. The world saw a worker, but he was building something else entirely. The sun dipped below the horizon, but David's day was far from over. He spent his hours in cramped, lightless crawl spaces, wedged between insulation and floor joists, wrestling with rusted valves and leaking copper. The work was demanding, leaving his muscles tight and his skin layered in dust. He would return home, discard his heavy boots, and wash the grime from his arms in the kitchen sink. By 8 o'clock, the kitchen table was no longer a place for dinner. It was a command center. He cleared away the clutter of his day to make room for stacks of investment reports and market journals. His fingers, still stiff from turning wrenches, carefully traced lines of complex financial data. He ignored the fatigue pulling at his eyes, focusing instead on growth rates and expense ratios. He cross-referenced performance metrics with the same intensity he applied to a failing water heater. While the neighborhood grew quiet and the streetlights flickered on, David remained anchored to his research. He was not merely reading, he was architecting a future that existed only in his ledgers. Every number he analyzed represented a brick in a wall that would eventually house his freedom. He closed the final report, turned off the lamp, and prepared his gear for the next day, his mind already calculating the next move. The calendar pages turned, but Tilly remained fixed. David was a ghost in the machinery of the city, a man who arrived at 6 in the morning and left only when the pipes were silent and the leaks were sealed. He became a fixture in the basements of his neighborhood. He knew the groan of every water heater and the specific resistance of every valve. He fixed, he earned, he deposited. The cycle was as reliable as the tides. Winter storms gave way to spring heat, and still, the ritual held. Every month, he walked into the same brokerage office and handed over the surplus of his labor. He did not look for immediate gratification. He did not watch the ticker tape for daily fluctuations. He simply added more. The accumulation was slow, methodical, and invisible to those who measured success by the cars parked in the driveway. He spent his mornings in the damp dark of crawl spaces and his afternoons in the quiet efficiency of the bank. Year after year, the weight of his effort shifted from his hands to his portfolio. He was building an engine of growth that required only time and consistency to run. The world continued its frantic rush, oblivious to the steady, silent construction happening under its feet. The morning sun caught the side of the truck, highlighting every dent and patch of rust on its frame. A young apprentice stood by the passenger door, kicking at a loose tire, his eyes roaming over the faded paint. He looked at the neighbor's driveway, where a polished sedan sat gleaming, then back at the truck. "Why keep this heap around, David?" the apprentice asked, a smirk tugging at his mouth. "You pull in good money. You could be driving something that does not scream failure. David did not look up from his toolbox. He slid a heavy wrench into place with a sharp metallic clack. He stood, his gaze steady, and pointed toward the massive site across the street where the framing was nearing completion. "That truck hauls my tools," David said, his voice clipped and devoid of humor. He tapped his chest pocket, where his wallet sat heavy against his ribs. "These dividends haul my future." The apprentice opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, his brow furrowing as he tried to reconcile the man before him with the words he had just heard. David did not wait for the confusion to clear. He turned the ignition. The engine sputtered into a rhythmic, familiar roar, and he pulled away, leaving the young man standing alone on the curb. The rain began as a drizzle but turned into a relentless downpour by the time David packed his final wrench. His muscles ached with a dull, rhythmic throb that had become his only companion. He trudged through the mud, the weight of his boots pulling at his calves with every step. The sky was the color of bruised slate, casting a gray gloom over the suburban street. He reached the truck and hauled himself into the cabin, the door clicking shut with a familiar, metallic protest. Outside, the windshield wipers slapped against the glass in a frantic, uneven beat. David slumped against the driver's seat, his breath hitching in his chest. His hands were raw, stained with grease and grit that no soap could truly lift. He did not start the ignition. He sat in the dark, watching the water streak the glass, feeling the vibration of the storm against the frame of the vehicle. His pulse slowed, matching the heavy rhythm of the rain. The day had been long, the work grueling, and for the first time in years, he felt the true gravity of the path he had chosen. He remained motionless, staring out into the blur of the storm, waiting for the silence to settle deep into his bones. David reached toward the glove box. The latch clicked, and he pulled out a folded document, the corners softened by months of friction. His hands, still stained with the day's residue, trembled slightly as he smoothed the paper over his knee. The interior of the truck smelled of damp fabric and old oil, but his focus narrowed to the bottom right corner of the statement. He traced the line with his thumb. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The total stood firm, a string of digits that defied the grime and the rain outside. He blinked, shifting his position to catch the dim dashboard light. The number remained unchanged. 7 figures. A decade of early mornings, cramped crawl spaces, and diverted paychecks had condensed into this one static line of ink. He leaned his head back against the seat, the reality of the accumulation washing over him. The ache in his shoulders seemed to recede, replaced by the cool, hard clarity of the math. He had not gambled. He had not rushed. He had simply persisted. The rain hammered against the roof, but he barely heard it now, his eyes locked on the paper as the magnitude of his silent victory took hold. David held the paper steady. The digits did not flicker or fade. They remained a permanent testament to the thousands of hours spent in dark basements and under leaking sinks. He looked at the dashboard, then back at the ink. No one else knew. No one else saw the path he had carved out from the fragments of his daily wages. He began to fold the document, creating sharp, precise creases. He pressed his thumbnail along the edges until the paper was once again a small, compact square. He did not smile. He did not exhale in relief. Instead, he reached out and popped the glove box open once more. He slid the statement into the dark cavity, tucked behind a bundle of old receipts and a spare tire gauge. He pushed the latch home until it clicked, sealing the secret away. The silence of the truck cabin felt different now, heavier with the weight of absolute security. He did not need to announce this. He did not need to change his course. The wealth was not a prize to be displayed, but a foundation he had built brick by brick. He wiped his palms on his trousers, clearing the last of the grease, and placed his hands firmly on the steering wheel. The storm outside continued to beat against the metal, but the internal pressure had vanished, replaced by the quiet, unshakable certainty of a man who had won his own game. The engine turned over with a familiar, rhythmic shudder. David checked his mirrors, the glass reflecting nothing but the rain-streaked road ahead. He could have turned the wheel toward the highway. He could have walked away from the tools, the grease, and the constant calls. The 7-digit figure sat quietly in the glove box, a silent engine for a different life. Yet he reached for the gear shift instead. He eased the truck forward, the tires crunching against the wet gravel of the driveway. He did not look back at the house he had just repaired, nor did he look toward the horizon of an early retirement. He navigated the turn, his hands steady on the worn plastic of the steering wheel. The job was not a burden. It was the mechanism that had built his freedom, and he refused to let the success change the man who earned it. He checked his watch. Another call was waiting, another faucet needed fixing, and another hour of his day remained. He pressed the accelerator, the truck gaining momentum as he merged into the gray, evening traffic. He drove toward the next house, his purpose intact, his routine unbroken, moving forward with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who owned his time completely. The streetlights flickered to life as David pulled up to the final curb of the day. He stepped out into the damp air, his toolbox heavy and familiar in his grip. He walked to the porch, knocked twice, and waited for the door to open. Inside, he knelt on the floor to inspect a dripping valve, his movements precise and unhurried. He worked with the same focus he had applied 20 years ago. The world moved around him in a blur of frantic status and visible display, yet he remained untouched by it. He tightened the nut, wiped the pipe clean, and packed his gear. No one watching him would ever guess what he had achieved. There was no mansion to show, no luxury to broadcast, and no desire for recognition. He simply finished the task, accepted his payment, and walked back to his vehicle. He started the engine, the familiar vibration grounding him. As he pulled away from the curb, he disappeared into the evening flow of traffic, just another worker in the city. He had built his own world in the margins of his days, a silent, growing fortune that required no audience to be real. He drove on, the steady hum of the road beneath him, master of a life that only he would ever fully understand.